Welcome. The following presentation was recorded at the annual Best Practices for Pollinators Summit, hosted by Pollinator Friendly Alliance and the Xerces Society. Please consider participating in the annual summit next year. You can find more about the summit at pollinatorfriendly.org/summit.
Okay, yeah, my talk today is going to be on, we go back and forth, basically disturbance ecology. I like to call it renewal ecology also. And, but we'll talk about keystone herbivores and not fire in this case. And, you know, I really want to reach out to Pollinator Friendly Alliance and also the Xerces Society for hosting these programs every single year. An amazing group of people who are dedicated, some of the best scientists I've known along with these organizations, and also the dedication to preserving the natural world. And also as a platform to really reach out and try different things and to have fun with these presentations. So anyways, I really hope that we have fun today. I'm going to approach this from a kind of a higher level general principles concept, because I really don't want to tell my students or whoever I'm speaking to what to think. I'd rather have you teach you kind of to think for yourself. And so this is really meant to inspire you more than give you prescriptions on, you know, how many animal units per acre per day to graze and everything like that. And part of it is because I'm a big C.S. Halling fan, and he would always say to his students, whatever works at one particular time and space is completely the opposite at a different one. And he would smile and he'd rub his hands and he'd say, just experiment and see what you can do. So going back to C.S. Halling right now, I'm just going to, towards the end of his career, he came up with that there was two drivers and the declines of ecological integrity and in areas managed for nature. So two principal drivers to the declines of ecological integrity in areas we manage for nature. And the first one is the loss of the keystone process, okay? And that can be the disturbance regimes or the renewal regimes. And the second one is social myths. So these two are the main drivers: loss of the keystone process and then social myths. And you might wonder what a social myth is. And I'm just going to put up there for one that was around for a long time is fire is bad. And we'll explore a couple. So we'll explore both these frameworks and then allow you to see how you might be able to incorporate grazers and food webs into a restoration. So it's really about food webs, not just about grazers, but in order to have those carnivores, we need to have the grazers. And I said long ago when the state of Minnesota came up with recommendations for improving pollinator habitat, I said, you know, try to understand pollinators as grazers or herbivores. And, you know, it sounds like, oh, well, yes, of course. But really, if you think about it, it's a very high principle way of thinking about it, because if I'm going to restore any one component of a trophic level, let's say it's the grazing level, the herbivores, the second trophic level, I really want all those I want all those components, all those species in that trophic level to be there, because I believe we can't just focus on one. We have to have organizations that focus on those particulars, but as a whole community restoration or conservation community, we need to focus on the whole entire trophic level to refuel those food webs. I'm going to borrow a Leopold analogy here, a metaphor, I guess. It's a three-legged stool, and these are milking stools. Nobody really knows that anymore. But and Einstein said that a model should be as simple as possible, but not too simple. So if I took one leg off of that, it would be too simple. It wouldn't function anymore for sitting under and milking a cow. If I added another leg, it wouldn't really increase the stability or the function or the power of the model, but it would make it heavier and more clunky. And each leg I added to that model, the more clunky, the more heavy, and actually the more unstable it might become because I can't get all the legs stippled. So I love that metaphor, the three-legged stool. As I approach restoration, hello?
Your audio is a little choppy, so we're going to try just turning your face video off.
Yeah, please do.
See if that helps. Okay. Okay, there we go.
Thanks. Okay. So as a restoration ecologist, I like to think of the three legs in that stool as site preparation, installation, and restoring the processes. I think we've gotten really good over the past 20, 30 years at the site prep and the installation, but there's a long way to go in restoring the processes. And if I don't do that, the stool will topple over and not function. So the real question is, how do we know what those historic processes were? And, how do we know how they functioned? I mean, what were the timing, the frequencies, and the intensities? And this requires a really deep natural history. And I'm a real fan of reading deep, deep, deep into time. I mean, even millions of years, and we'll get to that in a second. But our current natural history narrative, we kind of like, we always think that, oh, you shouldn't be reading any papers older than 10 years old. But, one of my favorite papers I'll show you in a second here is written in 1634. It's a 3-volume set written where New York is. Thomas Morton wrote it. About one volume is about how the indigenous cultures use the land. The other one is about, what plants are useful, et cetera. It's like, there's so much knowledge in that stuff that we don't teach anymore in universities. And it's kind of sad. Most of our natural history comes from what we call the vegetation of Minnesota at the time of the Public Land Survey. And this is the Public Land Survey. And this, of course, is the Marshner map right here. There's another one in Minnesota that's very useful. And that's the Trig map. Oh, you don't have my face screen on. I was going to hold the Trig map up. But when this was taken between 1858 and 1909, it's quite a spread in time. This really occurred 200 years following the demise of native herbivores and Native Americans. And so a better prehistory model for how this ecosystem functioned would be a pre-Columbian. And that's really exciting because it really drives us to try to model what that's like. Can we ever be right? No. But we never write about anything in ecology. We can only model and do these scenarios and talk about it and modify our stories. And so that's the exciting part of it. But to think about the pre-Columbian model, we can go back further and we can understand the fossil record here all around the world that mammal herbivores co-evolved with the historic vegetation 35 million years. And humans have managed the landscape for thousands of years, primarily to increase herbivores. We believe in Africa, for example, 1.6 billion years now are some of the newest numbers on how long humans have used fire to attract herbivores. In Europe, 400,000 years. And whenever people got to North America, and there's a wide range of dispute there. I'm not even going to go near that one. I'm always pulling for the oldest possible dates possible, but we'll see how it goes. It's exciting in science, new discoveries. But I would say, I would leave us with this and this traditional or this historic model that we are naive to understand the land mechanism without that traditional knowledge and without those native herbivores. Okay. Some of the really important papers written from this University of Wisconsin, they're really, worldwide famous geography department. The Pristine Myth, 1992 by William Denneman. And then, of course, out of the University of Madison too was Bill Cronin with his work, Changes in the Land, especially the first couple chapters are really good for the ecology. And there's Thomas Morton's book over on the right-hand side, maybe it's on your left-hand side, but 1634, 3-volume set. And you can get these online, read it online too. But I like to go back in the fossil work because I really want to understand where my vegetation came from and who it came with and what it came with, like grazing animals and fire. And our grasslands represent the most advanced, evolutionary speaking, productive, functional, edible, terrestrial ecosystem ever on the planet Earth. And I don't want to be like local to just prairie and oak savanna. Think of the tundra. The tundra is a grassland with grazing caribou and sedges and small trees. I guess it's a savanna. Some people have called it the Arctic prairie. So it's kind of an interesting way to think about it. That's our target for sustainability in a real-time solar energy. We produce more, purified more water, built more healthier soils, built more food than any other terrestrial ecosystem ever on the planet. So it's kind of a cool. But through this process of coevolution, what we see is that we know the herbivores are completely obligate to the vegetation. But what we fail to think is that the vegetation is obligate to the herbivores. So our pollinators, it's an easy example of the pollinators because we know the pollinators are obligate to the vegetation. And we also know the vegetation is also obligate on the pollinators. It goes right up to buffalo and sloth bears and caribou. Let's take an example here. Let's take a look at the Minnesota River Valley about 10,000 years ago. Right up on top of that hill is where the Mall of America and the airport's built. And this is kind of the glacial river Warren coming through about 10,000. And there are humans living there.
For it.
This is
Okay. So let's come into the current context right now. We're looking at the Minnesota River Valley for our example here. And this is 1491. So I'm going to go to the pre-Columbian timestamp on this and before Europeans arrived here. And we're just going to take a look at the same bluff that's overlooking the Minnesota River right now. And it's, salt aspect, Hawick sand, gravel soils, perfect for short grass, prairie, and savanna. And if we look in this picture here, we see like a game trail walking up the trail there. I can actually see some oak trees off in the distance on the right hand or left hand side, depending on where you're sitting. Um, and then some of the flowers that are very common in this area, lead plant, prairie violets, Indian paintbrush, pasque flowers, prairie dandelions throughout this whole area. Some of these flowers actually grew in reference right along some of these game trails, and you could actually go to like, for example, Barn Bluff in Red Wing, Minnesota, and some of the most unique, there's a unique set of plants that are actually growing along these old game trails that now humans walk on. So it just kind of brings to mind what these impacts of these keystone herbivores would have created, these very micro habitats for different flowers, different habitat for pollinators. Okay, but if we go to the timestamp, if we increase our timestamp to today, this is what we're looking at. So that wonderful, beautiful, highly diverse oak savanna, shortgrass oak savanna has now become this afforested mess. The large log that you see laying in front of us is kind of an early indicator. That's a box elder, and I think some people can probably say, yeah, that's definitely a box elder. And they were one of the first trees that grew when we removed these herbivores. And then subsequently, it just got more and more and more treed. And you can see all that wonderful vegetation, that grassland, savanna vegetation has been completely eliminated. So we might look at this from 1491 to today and say, wow, what happened? 70 years ago, it was still in pretty decent savanna shape. The aerial photos show that. I actually had a gentleman who grew up in that area show me a Polaroid photograph from 1957 looking up from the river valley on the hill, and there were several Angus cows up there in Bloomington in 1957, and it was all just like little blue stem and with big oaks up there, and this is what we see today. So basically, the only thing that I can see that changed, the city grew up around it, obviously, but we literally removed the people and the animals from the land again. The first removal was of the Aboriginal, Native American, indigenous cultures from this land and the animals that they actually, help manage in this area too. We actually called the site like a nature preserve at that point and turned it into a refuge for wildlife. But what's really kind of interesting is that the current condition, I'm looking right at the ground layer right now, there's not enough edible vegetation there to support a deer mouse, let alone a cottontail rabbit or a deer. And although deer will live here for kind of like shelter, they come to my lawn in Bloomington to eat my plants, which I'm fine with because it's part of the process that maintains my prairie gardens. And then we put a label on it called oak forest because there are some few oak trees in here. But the tragedy of this is that there has been no oak regeneration in at least 70 years. In doing a biological survey down here, the youngest oak I could find was probably 70 years old, and there was one. And then the next level jumps to like 100, maybe even 200 years old before we get to the next. So, and we're losing oaks every year. Like I'm thinking like 5 to 10%. Windstorms, diseases are just blowing down, no regeneration. So probably in my lifetime, there will be no more oaks remaining in the so-called oak forest. So something to consider. So even oaks at this point, we can think about as being in some context graze obligate. They needed those grazing animals to keep the site open, and humans using fire to encourage grazing also keep these sites open. The oaks would take off at that time during hard winters, 2 or 3 hard winters in a row. The herbivore populations would diminish, the oak trees would spring up. And that's really what we need to, think about when we do our restorations like this. And so it's easy to find something to blame. And in this case, we blame the invasive species. And I got social myth there, kind of going back to the beginning and with a question mark there. But, in the early 1990s, I was very evangelistic about invasive species, well before a lot of people were even talking about it. But now I really question it. And I see it more as a continuum between a species being purely invasive and a species being symptomatic of the loss of the keystone process like grazing and fire. Another closer look at the soils, we've lost the O horizon, so that massive carbon storage has completely disappeared. The grasses, the wildflowers, everything has just gone away. And carbon in this case is actually leaking into the atmosphere as we're oxidizing all of this carbon that had been built up in the soils since the glaciers 10,000 years ago. This is actually the same area. It's a picture of where there are indigenous mound features in this area that have just, with the soil, the loss of the monocot roots and the prairie wildflowers, the soils have just eroded. You can barely pick out those mound features in there. That's always a solid stand of buckthorn right there. And this is the exact same area. Again, there's no ground layer vegetation. What's a mouse or a deer or a cottontail rabbit going to eat there? And so the question is, how did this happen? And so my thesis or the assumption of this talk is we lost the keystone process. And the number one keystone process was herbivores with this vegetation for 30 million years at least, maybe even 35 million years when the grassland savannas kind of took over on the terrestrial planet. And then more recently, humans using fire to to increase these herbivore populations. There's a great George Catlin painting, probably about 1836 out in the Dakotas. You can see some white-tailed deer are jumping across the flames like that. So let's talk about the proximal processes that maintain these really healthy ecosystems. And if you really look at it, and this is the way I've looked at it and the way I think about it, we're always looking for feedback, other ideas. So we share these stories like today. But I think that the proximal primary process that maintained these very highly diverse functional ecosystems was biomass harvest. And that harvest occurred in ways that regulated these nutrients to the benefit of an ecosystem. And let's look at an analogy, my body, for example. My body, every cell in it is regulating nutrients like crazy. It's just like shuttling sodium this way and potassium that way and nitrogen this way and carbon that way. And that's the essence of my life. And I do know I'm a pet owner. I have been all my life, and I have put several pets down to sleep, as they call it in the vet office. And that shot of sodium pentothal literally stops that nutrient regulation process. And the animal, in this case, passes on within multiple seconds, or you mean literally seconds. And so if we destroy those nutrient regulation mechanisms, the organism dies or the ecosystem dies. So it's kind of an interesting way to look at it. And the best way to regulate those nutrients is through highly evolved, elaborate, multi-trophic level, multi-cycling food webs that pose strong control over those nutrient cycles. And keystone species are a big part of that. And again, the two primary mechanisms: herbivores, mammal herbivores, and indigenous fires. Since, whenever people arrived in North America, and that's a whole nother story, which was kind of fun to think about. And remember, we need to remember that fire was primarily designed to increase herbivore populations. And so that's your classic trophic scale, the pyramids going up, decreasing energy as you go higher. So you get the pyramid effect like that. And those arrows are showing calcium and phosphorus and sodium and nitrogen just regulating through this whole system to the benefit. It's like a choreographed dance or a symphony orchestra where each and every single species is a note, and together they form this beautiful, beautiful music. So that's one way to think about it. A really eloquent way to think about it is like caught by Aldo Leopold in 3 pages, maybe 4, but it's in his classic work, Odyssey, and it's just so beautiful. And he actually shows how this X molecule, which I believe is nitrogen, would, you know, gradually by gravity go lower and lower and lower into a river, but then would be captured by like a muskrat or a frog or a turtle, and brought back out and go higher and then back down to the river and then back up and down. And within 10,000 years, that one molecule would have traveled like a half a mile down that river. But more recently, within a year, it can be in the Mississippi River. So we've literally destroyed these complex nutrient cycles. So let me show you one really cool example for how keystone species really impose a strong control over nutrient cycles by biomass harvest. So I'm gonna bring in these two species here, and I did a lot of research when I was in Madison on these, and it was kind of mind blowing. And I actually had my advisor that never really said much to me at all. One day, one of his eyebrows went up, and he looked at me, and in his deep British bulldog voice said, you have created 200 careers of research with this work here. And it's just a story. It's a good story based on a lot of good evidence, but let me go through the story really quick, like, and hopefully wow you into seeing how two species could align themselves in time and space and regulate massive amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus to the benefit of our water quality. So, introducing the canvasback duck, Athea vallisneria, and wild celery, which is Vallisneria americana. I want to show you the names I highlighted, the generic names, Vallisneria and Vallisneria. This name comes from an Italian botanist. It doesn't really matter, but what matters most is wild celery was named in 1727, and they put that name in there, Vallisneria. In 1828, almost 101 years later, Alexander Wilson, the famous ornithologist, was collecting this bird in the Chesapeake Bay, and he was asking the local hunters who were, you can imagine how primitive the guns were in those days, but he asked these local hunters, you know, about this animal that they thought was the European pochard, but Alexander Wilson really said, this is a different animal for sure, different bird. And so the hunters are telling them, yeah, this duck shows up. We don't know where it comes from. You can imagine that migration. We knew nothing about it. It just appears one day in late November in Chesapeake Bay, and they're really skinny and they don't taste good, but they eat that plant right there. And he picks the plant up and looks at it. Wow, this is cool. And within like 4 or 5 days, they get nice and fat, and then they're so tasty. They're the best eating duck, boom, boom, boom. So that's how the duck is associated with the plant way back, 150 years ago, that the duck literally needs that plant to survive. So let's look at the duck more specifically. The canvasback duck is really one of the most advanced birds, evolutionary speaking, that we know of. It's highly endothermic. It flies on the level, maybe the fastest flying bird, like 80 miles an hour straight out. Its metabolism is just wild. Just the heartbeat's just an amazing animal. And we always like to say it's pushing the limits of duckism. Like, that bird is so big and chunky, if it was 1 gram larger, it would have to become a goose. So one way to think about it is that the canvasback flying is like a jet airplane. 1 gram bigger would have to go to goose again. Honk, honk, flap, flap. So they literally structured, we believe the numbers and their populations literally structured the entire food web. Canvasback decoys from New Mexico, 4,000 years old. I don't think the Native Americans were sport hunting. There were so many of these ducks that was definitely worth their time to make decoys, wade into the water, and actually collect these things. So very prominent, kind of like the aquatic version of our bison. Wild celery. This is an amazing plant. It's dioecious, so there's like male and female plants. The pencil is pointing at where the male flowers come out of. They pop out of this little Stadex down there and they float to the surface. They open up their petals like sails. They float around. They're just teeny, teeny, teeny. They look like white dust on the water surface and they float around like sailboats. And that's the female flower then on the big pigtail there. And that pigtail can rise to the surface and come back down, or rise to the surface and come back down. And on the right day, calm water, that female flower in the fingertips here will rise to the surface and pull down and create like a vacuum that all these male flowers float right into. And that's where fertilization. But more importantly, they do asexual reproduction. And these are the potatoes that they produce underwater. And they can produce up to like 800 potatoes the size in 1 square meter. So think about that, 800 of these in 1 square meter. And I did not tell you that, but historically, we even see descriptions even up to 1900 from Minnesota. Heron Lake, Minnesota was a famous canvasback lake of like, there would be thousands of acres in these lakes of wild celery. Amazing. And that's a picture. You can see the wild celery. Think of 1,000 acres of that plant like that underwater, just thousands of acres. And here's what's really cool. In October, the vegetative component that you see of that wild celery just kind of breaks off. It goes into senescence, floats to the surface, and the wind will blow it off. And the pioneers talk about the wind, so much wild celery get blown up on the shore that would knock over docks and boathouses. That's how much wild celery is coming out of there. And all those tubers are left on the bottom, hard marled, biologically engineered soils, just sitting there, highly edible, highly digestible, just laying there on the bottom. Like, is that a mistake? Highly edible, highly digestible, highly palatable, and now there's no hiding, no camouflage, anything. It's almost like screaming out, "Eat me, please, I am here." And about that time, the canvasbacks arrived from Canada. They funnel off of all that whole prairie pothole region into a select group of lakes in Minnesota, and they chow down. And they chow down for a period of about 10 days. And they take those 800 tubers down to about 240 tubers. And there's really good research on this in the 1980s out of Pool 7 down by La Crosse. Excellent research. Scuba divers, traps excluding canvasback feeding, weighing canvasbacks when they arrive versus when they exit, etc. So there's a lot of good hard data there down there about canvasback herbivory on wild celery. But after 10 days, the tubers would decrease to 240, and the canvasback's like, oh my gosh, there's not enough worth me diving back down to get another one of those tubers. So let's fly off to the next set of canvasback lakes. And so they just transform significant quantities of vegetation into animal matter. And we can measure that by calories and joules, photons, and entropy. So this is just looking at the data that we collected from pools number 7. We know nothing of those historic numbers of canvasbacks. There is a PhD after PhD after PhD paper on how we can figure out what those historic numbers really were. But just from some random shots that we have from descriptions of duck hunters in Heron Lake in 1900 of flocks being 750,000 in one flock, we estimated on a conservative basis that would mean that these canvasback ducks eating those tubers would export out of that lake after 10 days 70,000 pounds of nitrogen and 8,000 pounds of phosphorus in a period of 10 days every single fall for thousands and thousands of years, which would maintain the clear water state, exporting those nutrients out. But then about the same time, the weapons that we used to hunt canvasbacks went from the front loading where you'd get one shot and would take 2 minutes to reload your gun, etc., into some really major technological advancements of a repeating gun. The very first automatic weapon, fully automatic machine gun, was developed to kill canvasback ducks, and that was the Model A5 Browning. And they had a 17-shot extension tube on them. It was an 8-gauge. Today we use like 12 gauges hunting ducks, So this was a weapon designed not for recreational hunting, but for capturing and killing canvasback ducks. We were shipping these all the way to England in barrels of ice and in gunny sacks, hence the name canvasback. Return the canvas back into the barrel when you're done emptying the ducks out. these market hunters down there in a picture were receiving about $3.50 for every canvasback they could kill in a day. And sometimes they would kill 100 canvasback. So there's a massive assault on these canvasback ducks. And once we eliminated those ducks, we destroyed the nutrient export mechanism for those lakes. And very quickly, the wild celery actually increased in numbers for a little bit, like 5-6 years. They talked about there were hardly any canvasbacks, but the wild celery was growing more and more and more. And that's what caused them to start thinking, it's like, the wild celery's here, where are the canvasbacks? And so the nutrients built up and built up and built up until this is what happened to these lakes. By 1917, our lakes in southwestern Minnesota and eastern Wisconsin were literally, they were saying, there's no more canvasbacks. Suddenly there's no more wild celery. Something's really gone wrong with these lakes. And we tried to restore these lakes starting back in 1921. So it's very well documented. So to end that story of the canvasbacks, what happened when we removed those keystone herbivores from that aquatic ecosystem, why would not those general principles of the herbivore eating the plants, regulating those nutrients, why wouldn't those same principles apply to our terrestrial ecosystems? And so that is kind of what we're going to look at the rest of this talk. Situation, what happened here? How did this happen? And again, we can use the framework. We say, well, we lost the keystone process of grazing. And when the grazers went away, the indigenous cultures went away too, and they carried their fire sticks. So grazing went away, and then the fire went away. We lost biomass harvest, we lost nutrient cycle, and the site became eutrophic. So the third leg in the stool, restoring the processes, becomes critical. For restoration ecology. Okay. So biomass harvest, let's get into that right now. There's three principal mechanisms that were used in biomass, or two: grazing and fire, and we can mimic it by haying. We won't talk about haying today. We talked about it yesterday in our panel discussion as being a really great way to mimic at least the biomass harvest component of grazing. But first, let's go to classic succession theory, a little bit of science here. And we've seen this before, bare soil to forest. But I want to ask a question of everybody in the audience and to myself as a community. Do we consider climax as the ultimate community goal? And I know I have. I've considered the climax communities where I want to be. And then, I started thinking about it, and disturbance theory helped me, and changed a little bit of way of thinking about that right now. So I'll get to that.
Steve, can you turn your video back on now, please,
Yes.
so we can see you?
Yep. You see me now?
Yes, everything's perfect.
Okay, good. So I think sometimes that we overly manage for climax, and this is just kind of a chart like that. In fact, we could even say that the early successional communities may be the communities of greatest special concern. It's just something to think about. And let's take a look at disturbance theory right now too, where we're going to go with the grazing. And the classic humpback curve, on the y-axis is biodiversity. And we see that with no disturbance, it's low. And then in the medium range, it's the highest. And then way too much disturbance, it crashes again into a very low area. So that's the classic humpback curve. And it was first brought to us in 1973 by Philip Grime, just passed away, a great British botanist. Joseph Cornell gets most of the credit for this in his classic tropical reefs, or tropical forest and coral reefs. And even Mr. Payne here, I love his paper in 1969, where he literally has tidal pools with 6 different species of mussel, and then a sea star that's eating the mussels. And where the sea star is, there's 6 different species of mussels. But as soon as he takes the sea star out of like 75 pools, the biodiversity goes down to 2 species. So you can see the disturbance of the predator, the biomass harvest on those mussels created greater biodiversity. So that's I love that Payne paper a lot. So this is where we're at. I mean, right in the middle of that hump there is just a perfect place to be. And so I always thought, Then I thought, okay, I'm not going to manage to climax. I want to manage in the middle. Right there's my target. So Western science, like I want to manage right for that spot there. Greatest diversity, greatest ecosystem function, greatest production, greatest ecosystem services right there. Wow, that's my target, right? Well, then Holling came into my life and he kind of changed my thinking on this now. And the climax, and this is his figure 8. It's the symbol of infinity. I've always wanted, I don't have any tattoos, but we always challenged everyone in my lab that would be the tattoo that we would have. So the climax is on top of the trees and the very new early successional is the grasses below. And so if things work well, we get to climax and a fire comes soon enough that it releases everything back again and the seed banks are all intact. So it just keeps coming. Whoa, whoa, it's in an infinity loop. There's changes and modifications, but that's the adaptive cycles of Holling that leads to adaptive management. But even more complex, a lot of areas in the landscape never get to climax and they're held in constant disclimax by grazing and fire. And so, and even in this middle area, it's just all these little loops that keep coming back. And it depends on where you are on the topography and your aspect and hydrology and how many grazers come through there and how many people burn in there. So that's my target. It's all of this at different percentages. And it's not just random. What's really interesting, I was just talking to Gabe Erickson that will follow me. We were at the Organic University a couple of weeks ago talking about this. But fire shadows, where the fires hardly ever got and allowed it to become climax, are the same places grazers couldn't go. So the grazing animals and the fire shadows overlapped. Perfect place for forest to be. And that's where our forest would definitely be, in those two shadows like that. This is just a null hypothesis. But let's say I was managing 1,000 acres and it had all these different topographies and hydrologies in it. I may want to manage 40% of it in the middle there someplace, keep disturbing it at different frequencies. And then I want to manage another 40%, either in late or early successional. And then at the very end, I'd want about 10% of my land in just deep climax. And also really super early, like trails coming through and just having bare dirt showing. So anyways, this is just a model to think about as we move forward. And Holling would even throw those figure 8s in there and say, well, even in these zones, you want it going back and forth. So it's kind of interesting. So let's talk about the herbivores quickly, and what they imposed upon the land that we're going to want to think about. And when I say Keystone Herbivores, I don't mean in size. I hear a lot of people talking about, oh, the mega herbivores. Mega herbivores could be 1 trillion billion spruce budworms coming through the boreal forest of Minnesota every 30 or 40 years, right? That's a mega herbivore. So think of size and force. Lemmings coming across the Arctic prairie and the millions of them mowing everything out. That's a mega herbivore. So don't just think in size, okay? But what did the countryside look like when 120 to 60 million bison roamed? I used to always try to figure out what the number was, the historic number. And I'm reading stuff like Hornaday's stuff right here, Sutton stuff right here, just classic stuff from 1909. And you know what? It's just a range. It always was a range. It always will be a range. And so that's something that just recently I've broken my mind from, saying it's a range. Population cycled up and down. And again, probably not randomly, which is kind of interesting. Same for the elk. I want to know what that looked like. And then all these other herbivores that we've had on the landscape too, pulsing. We know a lot about the bison. I won't spend too much time on the bison. There's a lot of good books that have recently come out on it. Again, I like to go to the original source. Hornaday is one of my guys. He's there 1889. He's actually out there. He's a naturalist at the New York Museum of Natural History. You can see the range went out throughout North America like that. This is Osborne Russell, just a couple of the pink here. Osborne's a journalist for the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1830. He said, this is boring. I'm going to move out west. And in 1830 and be a mountain man for 10 years. We don't even know where he was, but we think it's Western Montana and Idaho because there's no maps out there. They're just riding their horses, 6 or 7 other guys. But some of these notes here, the buffalo have entirely destroyed the grass through the country. The buffalo have consumed everything and not any grass grows. To see these disturbances coming on. This is really interesting to me. By 1839, it's over with. He's in Idaho. Minnesota isn't even a dream as a state yet. And he's saying it's over with. We've killed everything. Minnesota came, 50, 60 years before that. We killed everything here. So again, we even use art. We use old literature to read through this. Paintings by George Catlin. I like to say before the horse and after the horse. Things changed quite a bit. I'm pretty sure the two guys in the wolves there, I think the one guy is saying to the other guy, you sure this is a good idea? I don't know. So anyway, it's just kind of an interesting picture. And I like a lot of these. And then we do have current analogs. This is one of my favorite places to go camping. I really shouldn't tell you, but it's Theodore Roosevelt, the North Unit. You camp with the bison. It's like literally in the morning, you can get out of your tent and take a picture like this. Hornaday, here's his book. I love this, showing the migrations of the three big herds. And when I read Hornaday, this is really interesting to read. So the darker brown spot kind of in basically North Dakota. And then the spring migration, they'd spread out. And all these little yellow trails are kind of like where family units would break off. And the red ones at the below are where the southern herd is breaking off. And they'd spend the summers in these valleys, and then they'd get together in bigger and bigger and bigger herds. So it wasn't massive herds all the time. According to Hornaday, those are the winter herds. So it's really kind of cool to, I picture a valley in Montana with a family unit of bison, grandmothers, great grandmothers, grandchildren, et cetera, hanging out. What a great place to be. But so many disturbances. Thomas Seton in his classic Arctic Prairies diagram talks about Lane in the Arctic taking pictures of bison in a wall like this, and all the walls are fringed by anemones. So a windflower of some sort fringing every single wall like that. And these are still in our landscape today. That's North Dakota. That's my dog sitting in a bison wall right about 100 feet from where I was camping, right there. This is a floodplain in North Dakota on the Little Missouri River, where bison are allowed open access. You can actually see a building, restroom building, and a pickup truck in the background over there. Okay. Here's just a line. I'll just read this about 6 male bison did not go into the winter pen where we held them to feed them, and they spent the whole winter in the forest for 4 months. 6 bison, and they killed 3,000 trees. Okay, you can see the impact on how many trees existed even from the bison. This is back to Bloomington, where we don't have any bison in the river valley anymore. That looks horrible to me. I mean, there's no ground layer vegetation. I mean, there's nothing there to eat. There's no wildlife in that valley. Again, it's a wildlife refuge. And possibly the concept of floodplain forest is a social myth that's maintaining that condition. These are bison trails in North Dakota from aerial survey. The one on with the lake on it, you can see where the trails are coming to the same watering hole. Probably for thousands, even millions of years, they would use the same trails over and over and over again. Do you have trails coming through any of your restoration projects? I won't spend much time on elk. We are introducing them in most of the areas. Even up here in Duluth, where I'm at today, Fond du Lac is getting closer and closer. We think of them as a forest and a mountain deer, but they're only there because that's where they survived. Like the timber wolves are only in Ely, Minnesota, because that's where they survived. Okay, they're actually very well adapted savanna species. They can browse trees, they can eat grass, et cetera, et cetera. So a great animal. This one I'll spend a little bit more time on. There's a lot more popularity, and the beavers coming out. A couple classic books just recently. But we know how these ponds are just significant habitats for basically they produced, well, a paper here in Minnesota showed that like the landscape becomes 13% more wet where we do not trap beavers. And it's a shifting mosaic of ponds, sedge meadows, and shrub carr. And think if you're a pollinator, I mean, now you've got the pond habitat, you've got the sedge meadows habitat, you've got the shrub carr, all within a mile. So it's like the perfect habitat, and it's always shifting too. One's becoming more of a shrub carr, and then the beavers will cut the trees in it, open water. I paddled through some of these sections last year in the boundary waters, and they were completely fringed with bidens and Joe Pyeweed in the background. It was like a forest of bidens coming out of these flats where the dams had been broken open. Here's one we don't think about, and I just spent a little time on the muskrat recently, which have disappeared drastically, over 90% drops since 1990. They talk about eat outs, and this is an old picture here when you could walk from hut to hut to hut and never get your foot wet. And these maintain these marsh communities and kind of that, again, disequilibrium. They never got to be pure stands of cattails, which we see everywhere now. And there's no flowers out there, and there's no ducks out there, and there's no birds out there, because we're missing that herbivore. Okay, an older picture after the muskrats came through, and they talk about thousands of them coming in, crossing the roads and going on all the way through the prairies to South Dakota, Minnesota, and just eating everything in there, and the marsh would start all over again. We don't have that. This is Grand Mountain in Minnesota, and I only realized this yesterday. That Grand Mountain, the largest mountain in Minnesota, 25 feet high, 100 feet wide, 200 feet long, 9 to 600 years ago has been built. It's a muskrat up there in the Rainy River. So that's how much the people at that time were, the muskrat was about everything. Here's the muskrat population decline. It's a disease, but also the plant that they ate is so saturated with nitrogen now, especially from farming, which we started putting in 1980. We started putting like ammonium anhydrous in all of our croplands, super crazy amounts, 200 pounds per acre, and that always goes to the lowest section. And those cattails are so full of nitrogen. In fact, it's really coming out that our cattail problem is being completely driven by nitrogen. If there's too much nitrate in the cattail, it's toxic to the muskrat, which even if it ate a little bit, it would be very stressed, very susceptible to disease. So combination. Here's one just this morning, Plains pocket gopher. I've always thought of this thing as a keystone species. It's an herbivore. It lives underground and eats tubers like this. Vast areas underground at these things. But some people thought roughly that 25% of all the mammals in North America are fossorial animals, okay? In natural settings, a gopher and a ground squirrels can move up to 10 to 90,000 kilograms of per hectare per year. So that's a lot of soil. And I know in the soil health group with I belong to a lot, don't disturb the soils. It's like, don't tell that to the gophers. We want these guys back on our landscape like crazy again. And then they provided homes for all these other species right here. We actually have Brilliant owls on our farm again, thanks to the pocket gophers and some old CRP land. And of course, a lot of our minor bees, once again, are obligate to this. Look at that patch. And if you were a really good restoration ecologist, you could go out there and you could be seeding early successional species like right now, this time of the year, into those mounds. So in the spring of the year, you're just going to be getting this. And if you got enough of that seed out there and it produced its own seed as the gophers went across, you always have this early successional. So here's disturbance theory at a small scale. I mean, we get a big blue stem between these, and then here's brand new bare soil again. So the pocket gopher is a great way to get all that disturbance theory together. Here's a really interesting concept, grazing lawns. McNaughton says that these plants evolved with herbivores and became highly obligate to the herbivores. But in the hot summer, the grazers would move into the shade, they'd graze all that grass down, they'd move back out again. Predators kept things moving generally. The deer would come in and take it down a little bit further. Then the bunny rabbit could come in and take it down and groom it to the ground. Winter comes and the spring ephemerals are the outcome of that process. Simple model. This is McNaughton. It's a great paper, 1984. And he just talks about this coevolution. And the bigger herbivores facilitate to the smaller, to the smaller, to the smaller, to the smaller. And voila, we have spring ephemerals. Philip Grime, again, coming back to him, he said, when your woodlot has nothing but spring ephemerals and now the other functional groups are extinct, it's a sign of a novel disturbance, too much shade. And that's kind of cool. Here's the Prairie Lakes, Scott Affinson in Minnesota, and he talks about this process called the Prairie Oasis. All these cattails are growing here. There's no flowers out there, no pollinator habitat, no bird habitat really for a lot of different species. And then come the muskrat, and then comes the bison. And when they leave, they reset that marsh back, that early successional sear again. And we see this all over. And here's one up in northern Minnesota, the southwest facing slopes where you can still see some of the vegetation there, the open grown yellow birch trees, the large giant open grown white pine trees. In the wintertime, a lot of the herbivores, in this case it's caribou, would come down from the Canadian north and live on these southwest facing in the sun. It'd be 20 below zero outside, but in the sun it's like 60 above. And they would graze everything down. And in the spring, we had these unique flowers. This is just from some of those areas up there that are now vacant of herbivores, open grown yellow birch right there, and these patches like that. And these would be some of the flowers that are shifting to it. A lot of these you can have in your yard if you manage them as a grazing lawn. Bison lawns, elk lawns, caribou lawns, beaver lawns. the process of trails, and I really encourage people to think about putting trails into your prairies here and there, even if they're not real, but just to create some of that disturbance of the earth, where again the mining bees can hang out. You get special early successional flowers hanging out on those trails. But some of these trails, again, if you read in Africa, they could be millions of years old. We don't know. And here in North America, there's a good theory that our U.S. highways, Highway 12, Highway 14, Highway 212, they were actually built on these trails. So it's kind of interesting. Again, the fringe of these provide a lot of different habitats, a very micro thin area that doesn't get trampled. This is one thing I like to think about. Most of our aquatic species got in and out of the lakes on these trails, like blue-winged teal, for example, or snapping turtles. I'll quickly speed it up here because I'm just about over time. Another thing that I really am very interested in is herbivore dung. Here I have, this is a paddy out in North Dakota, and there's mule deer poop there too. Increases energy flow, nutrient cycling, ecosystem services. There's a dung beetle right there, a rove beetle up above in there. Here are a bunch of birds that are eating off those cow pies, picking out those insects from that. Again, here's another food web that's coming out of that dungivore. Here's a mouse eating a dung beetle that's eaten by a fox. So again, we go from 3 trophic levels: grass, buffalo, you know, and then a dung beetle, to now we're adding the mouse and we're adding the fox into it. So we're up to 5 trophic levels in nutrient cycling. Here's another herbivore, and this will be the last one we'll cover. I want to reach out to the invertebrates, because we think of furry things all the time as our main herbivores. But I want to talk quickly about spruce budworm and about the keystone herbivore of the North American locust. There's not much to talk about the locusts. They went extinct. The last one was found in 1905. I hear occasionally they wash up out of Lake Superior. The last known flock flew over Lake Superior, and probably a lot of them died and fell into the lake, and they still wash up on the shores every now and then here. But they've been extinct since about 1905. So we know nothing about this species that was once plagued. We know a lot about this species here, and this will be the last herbivore we talk about quick like here. But the spruce budworm is a native herbivore. I know it's a worm, you know, it's a lepidopteran larval stage. And we have tried so hard to kill this thing, so hard to kill it. It eats, its primary host is not really spruce. It doesn't damage the spruce. The spruce seems to be like, yeah, this happens every 30 years. It's the balsam fir. And so what you're looking at is balsam fir that's been stripped maybe 2 years in a row. Here's a white spruce, and it just shows this repeated spruce budworm on the rings every 30 to 40 years. This is a nice form of selective harvest. You know, if nothing else, this is a great way that we can go in and you know, keep some of the trees from filling in totally. This is in the 40s and the 50s. This is where C.S. Holling wrote his PhD about we gonna need to quit spraying the spruce budworm out, because they will naturally, it's a natural part of our cycle. And this is where he came up with the concept of resilience. He's living very close to Rachel Carson at the time, and she writes Silent Spring. So I'm sure the two of them were supporting each other. Holling got beat up very badly by the white scientists, you know, DuPont people like Rachel Carson did. And then he came out, his next paper was 1973, and it was called Resilience. So that's what he learned from it. These spruce budworm eatotes like this then become very prime for forest fire. And that's a renewal mechanism that we talked about right at the beginning. Right now in Pamagi Creek fire area up in the Boundary Waters, if we flew over that right now, the moose counts are coming out about 4.6 moose per square mile into Pamagi Creek burn pile. That's Isle Royale. Picture that from near 2000, actually, when there's 800 moose out there and 30 wolves. Look at that. You can look through Isle Royale for a mile in either direction. So it's more of a boreal savanna. Here's the Pamagi Creek fire. Here's the Pamagi Creek fire 10 years later. It's a grassland. Was it a grassland or a forest out in Glacier National Park? Like a 90-year-old ranger one day looked at me and said, I guess it depends on when you look at it. I'm like, wow, that's so cool. Here's, you know, again, 10 years after, or 4 years after, all the flowers that come up with that. This was just taken in the Greenwood fire the other day. Look at, that's a happy moose. Look at all the browse coming in there. The rabbits are coming in. You can see all those notches in the, that's where the cavity nester bees get in. So here the herbivores are actually helping the bees in that case. And so all these herbivores together are eating that vegetation, they're holding it from going back into this, where there's very little habitat for pollinators and very few other herbivores. So now the herbivore populations are crashing, except for one, the spruce budworm. And the spruce budworm can come back and eat those trees back down, and we'll get the fire again. If we hold it there too long, we go into a catastrophic regime shift, and basically it's non-restorable. So just quickly, I'll wrap this up. The importance of herbivores, just a real quick series of models here. With the herbivores, we're getting all this diversity. Some places get eaten a lot, some places get eaten never at all. So that huge wide degree to succession. If we take the herbivores out, the vegetation tends to grow out of control. Pretty soon we lose the ground layer species. And now it's so toxic that we can't put herbivores back in there. It's a toxic vegetation. It's the same in the northern area. And basically now herbivores can't live there anymore, including pollinators. So I think just 3 slides here. If we're going to bring in, there's a lot of science, and then Gabe's going to come on and talk a little bit more about how they're doing this. But if we're going to come in and start grazing in our restored prairies, we're looking at doing it in the best spots. And here's like a 40-acre or 100-acre square plot with domestic cattle in here, but we're picking the best spots and we're going to graze those in ways that maximize the diversity. Or here's a high ridge, low in nutrients. We know we can get prairie there, and it's the same thing. We'll graze them when we want to graze it for the biodiversity, for the pollinator species. So with that, I'm just going to say ecosystem restoration is the process of restoring those keystone mechanisms that maintain renewal of the desirable biotic configurations, maximize function and ecosystem services. And there's basically those 2 keystone processes, and it's literally grazing, and it's fire. So thanks a lot, everybody. And you can always ask me questions, and you can get a hold of me anytime you want. And I'd love to talk to you more. And I know it's time for me to